All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa, our second Philosopher-in-Residence series for the month of September. We had Wei H. Sang on this morning talking about the missing Weltanschauung. And today we have Jill Nephew returning to the Stoa, starting her Philosopher-in-Residence series on natural intelligence in practice. And if you recall, Jill was here about a month ago, having this amazing session, giving a breakdown of how the natural intelligence, or the breakdown of natural intelligence, is the root generator function of the meta-crisis. And so we're going to continue on that thread and continue our exploration on natural intelligence here at the Stoa for the month of September. And just to briefly introduce Jill, she's a technologist and founder of Inquire, a one-in-kind inquiry technology, making it possible for individuals and groups to access powerful inquiry processes around any topic. And I've been playing around with Inquire and their tool lucidly, and I definitely recommend it for people wanting to get into the inquiry game. So you can check that out on the website on the video description. So that being said, how today's going to work, I'm going to tag in Jill in a moment. I'm going to give her a screen share, and she's going to have a presentation for us, roughly about an hour, and then we'll have a Q&A for 60 minutes. So if you have questions anytime, feel free to pop it in the chat. You can ask Jill your question. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just indicate that, and I'll ask your question on your behalf. So that being said, Jill, welcome back to the Stoa.
Thank you. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to deal with my tech here for a second. Am I sharing screens? Not yet. Can people see only my slide and not my presenter view?
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
That's what you should be seeing. Great. Okay. So thank you so much, Peter, for inviting me to do this, and for everybody for attending. The spirit, as I understand the Philosopher-in-Residence, is to give people like myself a shot at trying to articulate some sort of formulation as a project to do with the Stoa and debut that. And so this will be the first time I'll be presenting this information. And so I will be greatly benefiting from your feedback and hopefully enhancing your understanding as well. I have been trying to explain this fairly abstract material for a while, and it's challenging. And so I really look forward to another shot to try to get from beginning to end a way of knowing this material. And so the way I want you all to come to know this material is laid out here on this slide. The idea here is that I will start with a conceptual framework and reasoning our way through that together, so that we can hopefully arrive at a really solid common language framework for thinking and understand central argument. And once that's in place, I want to leverage that. So this is going to be a building process into the next week, where I want to ground these conceptual examples into real world metaphoric examples. I wrote here a teaser, 4-dimensional chess with invisible fluid with a gun to your head, as a kind of scenario that we might be imagining into, and seeing natural intelligence in practice to contrast maybe what we're going to reveal as the alternative to natural intelligence. We're going to follow that up, hopefully getting this grounding by metaphor, resonance with direct experience, imagining into the world we're in, and start to map into what's promised of looking at existing systems and how natural intelligence would, bringing that lens in, what would we change? How would we reimagine them with what we get from week 1 and 2? And then week 4, ideally, is experiences together of exercising it. So you have a grounded direct experience of some of the things that we'll be speaking to in the first 3 weeks. I want to say that in the past, I feel like this information is very important to get across. And I have, until now, again, thank you, Peter, a container that required me to pack it into a set amount of time. So my last talk, I tweeted my talk because that's about how fast I could deliver the information. And I wanted to give a complete message in that container. In this container, what I really would like to do and invite you all is to try to slow down enough so that we can go to the speed of clarity on each concept. And if I need to, that would mean that that we may not get through all the material. Like we likely are not going to get through all the material I had for today. This week may bleed over to next week. So this may all have to stretch out. And if that happens, then I will either offer everybody to come do separate sessions away from the STO, or if Peter wants to host more sessions, we can eventually get through this map, so that the ideal goal is at the end, people have a very multidimensional knowing of what I'm talking about in natural intelligence. And hopefully they are persuaded with my central argument. So okay, good. I'm still learning how to use this presenter view. Okay, so this is a brief recap of the central argument that I'm not going to deliver this time as an argument. I'm just going to lay it as a framework that hopefully you will come to be persuaded about throughout the series. So the idea is that everything we're pointing to in the meta-crisis has a commonality, and that commonality comes down to a vulnerability in our attention system that it can get trapped. And that we can train for this and address this. This is an addressable thing. The science is in on how to do it and what we need to do. And that's only from 21st century cognitive science. But that is what I'm focusing on, is trying to compress, not knowing everything, just knowing enough of what we need to do to address it. It's not hard. And I believe the only barrier to adoption is understanding what it is and its relevance. And closing this vulnerability moves us towards emergence as a change vehicle through unpredictable envelopes of plausibility. I'll unpack all that over the weeks to come, but that's part of the central argument. And that this is a necessary condition for addressing the meta-crisis. If we don't address this root vulnerability, any other solution won't be viable, is my argument. That we may do other things in addition, but this is a necessary condition. So diving in here, the first concept I want to get everybody very clear on, I think hasn't been made clear in the past, is what do I mean by natural intelligence? So the term is designed to be, by definition, all-inclusive. It comes from the AI research community, or I'm using it as that is the source, which is when a researcher is saying, how do we replicate living system cognition, human living cognition? What will we need in order to fully capture what it means to be a human in all ways? That is natural intelligence. And what I'm going to argue is that any way we can cross-cut what we do with our cognitive system, which includes our senses, our emotions, our thoughts, everything, any way we cross-cut anything we do that would be cognitive is a subset, because all of it is towards this act of living. That's the argument I'm going to make. So this is not an and, this is meant to be, it's not clear what it is, but it is the all-inclusive of everything. And I think, I guess, Peter, you'll be monitoring if anyone has questions. I could pause at each slide, or else I could just say if there's any raised hands, I suppose.
We can always take questions at the end of the hour, but I guess if, we want to take questions in between?
Yeah, I think so. I think I want this to kind of build. So the idea is that each concept should be clear in people's mind. And if they have questions, we'll slow down on each one until it's clear and get to the next one.
So how about if anyone has questions for the Q&A portion, just put it in the chat. But if you have a burning question, you can raise your little hand. I think that allows Jill to see it.
Yeah, so if it's questions on a particular slide, that would be, we'll address it now. So, because we're going to refer back to this, and so each concept should be clear. And then the Q&A can be more, to get beyond maybe open questions about, blending these things together and whatnot.
Do you see that a Journey has his hand raised,
Yeah,
Jill?
yeah.
Okay, cool. So Journey, you can pop off mute.
Thanks. I'm just wondering, is there something distinct about spiritual insight that has it in quotation marks?
Yeah. Why did I put it in quotation marks? Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to remember why I did that. I think that I think I wanted to make it clear that it's a fuzzy term. That I think there's nothing beyond that other than saying that to some, spiritual insight might be more all-inclusive, and to others it's a very narrow term. So I think that's what I wanted to capture. So like an insight process, like self-inquiry's insight process, insight into self might be, or insight into the nature of existence, like deep insight might be one way people use it, and other people might mean it more in this all-inclusive, like anything that's an insight process that reveals deeper knowing or truthiness is part of in capturing that. So I'm saying I don't know how to containerize that one as obviously.
And I have a question. Could you delineate natural intelligence from the G factor or general intelligence factor?
I don't know what that is. Can you say more about that?
The thing that the construct that IQ tests are supposed to test for, like intelligence.
Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, I would say all of these. So yeah, let me talk about how would you test for natural intelligence versus how would you test for these other ones. So these other ones, you would have a person deciding on a metric and coming up with some way to put somebody into, an arena where they could maybe measure some level or amount of a thing. Natural intelligence is the only test for it is to take a thing, put it into nature, and see if it can live. Like really live, fully live. So that includes reproduce, self-organize, negotiate, niche, evolve, all the things it needs to live. So the only test for natural intelligence is living. So in that way, that's what makes it nebulous. And when AI researchers are attempting to build against that as a measure, they'll start to build creatures that are embedded in various types of natural environments and see how far they can get. What are the failure modes? What else do they have to include? Okay, now it's failed this way. What else do they have to include? So if we just imagine for a moment some of these like artistic sensibilities, well, why would that be in there? Well, if you look at what mating looks like in nature, without artistic sensibilities for a lot of animals, they wouldn't get a mate. So they're developing these beautiful creations and nests and diagrams and dances, and that appears to be part of it. So so we can kind of go through, if we wanted to, each one of these and say, oh, well, hold on, I see where that's embedded in the art and the part of living, thriving, existing. Cool. Anybody else want to? So when we talk about now, when I talk about the central thesis is that we have a vulnerability that's blocking our natural intelligence, I'm talking about any one of these. Losing access to any one of these would be detrimental to our ability to survive and thrive. There's going to be patterns in which ones are blocked, as we'll see in the Western world. But that's what we're talking about, is that somehow, for some reason, we're not able to access some sort of way of thinking, way of being in the world, way of cognizing our world. Okay, so now I'm going to start to build up. I'm going to start to build up kind of the conceptual pieces we need just to pull together into our more general understanding. And I'm going to start with the nature of our associative mind. This is important to understand. And so what this is, what we know, is that the way the mind works is that if you don't have an association to something in your mind, you can't bring it to mind. So if you have ever tried to remember something out of the blue, like tip of the tongue, a word you can't bring to mind, or place a face, or just out of the blue, try to remember what you're doing when you're 12, in the summertime. You are doing an exercise where you have to find an association. And until you find the association, you're blank. And then you find that first association, whatever it is, it could be a sense, a smell, something. And the whole thing comes back as a kind of gestalt. It's like this associative complex comes back. You have access to this whole world once you resonate into one of these associations. But if you don't have an association to it, it's like it never happened. So this is the way the associations work is tends to be by mood and by time. And in addition to everything else. So for instance, it's easier for us to associate forward in time. We can play videos forward in our life than to play them in reverse. It's easier to bring to mind things that match the mood we're in. But we are really, truly easily can find ourselves living a maze-like existence where the context brings in our associations, and we are not aware of everything that is outside of that context. And this is kind of the maze-like life we can end up in, where we can have these associations can be everything about us, our identities, our beliefs, our values, everything. We can have a whole different world and not know it within the way our lives can be arranged if they don't share associations. And I'm calling this the associative bias. So we're biased towards everything that's associated to the context we're in. And this is, as we're going to see, really important, because this is how we can control mind very easily. If we can control the container, control the associations, we control mind. Another example of associative bias that we experience every night is when we dream. That in our dream world, our system shuts off associations with our sensory experience and other associations. And depending on how many associations are shut down, we are not aware of being in a dream. We aren't shocked by how surreal a dream can be. We go along with it. And so this ability of going along with the context we find ourselves in is the nature of what can create a vulnerability of where we can be completely defined by our environment if nothing reminds us back of the outside association. So this is this nature of the mind is what's leveraged when we talk about cults or mind control or artificial memory, like implanting false memories of things that didn't, like getting people to commit to crimes they didn't, admit to crimes they didn't commit. Things like that are all leveraging this associative bias mind. So is everybody good so far? Okay. So that's a necessary ingredient to have in mind, is that that's how our minds work. And now I'm going to jump to another concept that we're going to need, which is levels of cognition and conceptual blends. I'm going to talk about this in the abstract, and we're going to spend a lot of time developing these ideas. So these are two different concepts distilled from two different source books. I highly recommend people have a look at if they're interested in this kind of thing. The level of cognition or ladder Causality is from Judea Pearl, The Book of Why, and Conceptual Blends is from a classic, The Way We Think, Conceptual Blending and the Mind's Hidden Complexities, Falconer and Turner at the bottom there. And the basic idea here is that that there are ways we approach the world, ways we think, and that there are simple and more complex levels. And so on the left is Judea Pearl system, where we have at the lowest level, we have just the associative mind, causality, which we're going to go into and show examples of in a minute, as the very simplest way we think, and a little picture of a robot and very simple animals. And then we go up into different ways of knowing. So we have intervention, which people might think of as participatory, but where we're experimenting and we're testing, we're probing, we're playing. And then we get into counterfactual, we're doing thought experiments, and we're starting to bring in this whole world of how we can bring together concepts in our mind to actually reveal true things about the world, reveal accurate things about the world, have accurate insights about the world. And then on the right, the conceptual blends really blows out that Judeo-Pearl counterfactual into all the ways we do that, with lots of examples from language and from real world examples of how we do that. And I'm going to show some here in a minute. And so this is basically how we think. This is how humans cognize. And what we're going to be speaking to a lot in this series is how incredibly powerful this is, and how we are going to, how much there is to lean on, to leverage in our natural intelligence. So basically, the natural intelligence is the gestalt of all of this. And we're going to talk about what happens when it's trapped, where it gets stuck. And so let me go back actually to this one for a minute, or maybe I'll jump ahead. Okay. So the lowest rung, or the basic lowest level in this ladder of causality, the way we think, is a parts to whole, categorized category of things, countable things, meaning we can say that this thing's like other things and do statistics on it. It's the world of things. It's normative, so we can say what an average is. We can take average of things. They're static, they're not changing. Feedback doesn't work. So in systems like this, they don't acknowledge feedback. The only way interactions can happen is causally, which is through forces, and it's a description of closed systems. So, so this is the world of engineering, of machines. This is the world of procedural knowing. This is what people point at as reductive thinking, and this style of thinking, this lowest rung thinking, is also the domain of just the analytic intelligence. When we are in this kind of thinking, does not admit other forms of intelligence. It is the nature of the information going in that constrains the way we think. So when we interact with systems like this is the kind of intelligence that is brought out in us. So that's an important point, that in this model, we're going to talk about natural intelligence. How we interact with the information in our world dictates how we respond through our cognitive abilities. In contrast, we can say, well, what isn't that? Okay, so that was very simple. This is a very simple list. Like, that's it. Statistical, closed systems, parts. Things are broken into parts. They're countable. They interact like Newtonian, like billiard balls. Very simple formulation of the world. And now if we say, well, what's everything else? And everything else is dynamic. So it changes over time. In that previous formulation, things can't change over time. Things can have have cycles and systems and different ways that they evolve. They can have evolutionary qualities. They can have things you can sense into a flow, or a kind of growing, shrinking. Anything that's a change over time has to be part of this system. It's interactive, it's relational. So it's defined by the interactions and the relations, not the parts. Those blue dots are my way of showing that these interactions carve out voids that we can point at as things, and those things are transient. So they emerge through the gaps in what's plausible in this interactive relational model. They're polyadic, and what that means is that that the influence of these springy things represent the interaction between what emerges as the voids that'll become clearer later, and the springy things, these interactions between the things that interact, the voids, the emergent phenomena, interact with each other, so that it's not, they interact with each other so that their net effect is not additive. Their net effect is emergent. That's what polyadic means, that you change the system as you bring in pieces, because the pieces interact as well. So everything's interacting with everything else. This is a highly interactive model. It's not individual fields that layer. It is interactive fields that change based on their own interaction. Things are not separable. They're open systems, fluid systems, sensory-based. So senses are based on open systems. So open, feedback, dynamic. I'm just trying to give everybody a feel for how much is excluded with the simple model. So this is like the sense of everything else that is missing when we do the other frame. These are evade our articulation often. They can only be known through experiencing, and they're kind of they are the iceberg underneath the tip, which is what can be articulated in our ways of knowing. And to think about how we might do a reality check on, are we allowing for this part of the world, the universe, the natural world in our thinking? A reality check would be to say, whatever framework someone's working with, would it apply to a purely fluid system? So pure fluid systems like atmosphere, oceans, anything you imagine with flows, the nature of flows, the nature of turbulence, the nature of boundaryless, the nature of emergence, can be a thought experiment reality check to see if our system holds up. And so if we look at the style of thinking in the world, this breakdown, this reality check, you can start to see through this lens, almost like a particle wave duality that we know about a particle wave duality. But if you look out in the world, we have a preference towards particleatedness. We have a preference towards partness. And we have the waviness, the fluidity as an afterthought. In reality, in the real world, the more real is the waviness, the more real is the open systems, the more common is the open systems. So we may wonder, why is it that we tend to favor the other one? And we'll get into that. But a lot of it has to do with the fact that it can be articulated. And so it goes along with control, it goes along with prediction, it goes along with technology, it goes along with analysis, but it is not the whole story when it comes to the real world. It's only applicable to closed systems. So in order to work with that world, by metaphor, a fluid world, a dynamic world, you start to bring in all what are the non-analytic intelligences as ways of knowing, ways of applying, and ways of imagining into. We're going to make this more and more ground as we go, but I just want to start with kind of the most abstract, maybe that for what it's worth. Is there any questions at this point? Okay, so now we're going to start to get into probably a little more familiar territory. So for people who have read Ian McGilchrist's work, which I highly recommend, Master and His Emissary, we can see that that there's really nice, it's not a nice representation of the split, that we're talking about two separate things. And Master and His Emissary, Ian McGilchrist points out the fact that we are built for 500 million years to have a split attention system. We are built to be able to construct these closed causal systems and work with this unarticulated, amorphous, soft kind of attention, the diffuse attention, the focus attention, that we are designed to not have those always perfectly equally represented. We are designed to be able to quickly contract into creating closed causal systems and expand into diffuse aware systems and coordinate our attention between them. So, so we don't want to say that the closed causal system is the enemy, as we're going to see as we start to more deeply work with what a coordinated system looks like. What the problem is quite specifically when that closed causal system gets trapped. And we're going to talk about how that happens. So in Master and His Emissary, he talks about the fact that, which we're going to go into more, this trapping of the attention system, he is saying, has all the signatures and the evidence that it is the making of the Western world, that and the making of the parts of the Western world that we would consider insane, not grounded in reality by definition. So so let's now unpack that a little bit more. So so just so people aren't familiar, the idea is that we have two attention systems separated biologically with a corpus callosum between them. And the point of having them separated and the corpus callosum is that that thing is not about connecting them, it's about keeping them separate. We actually build in mechanisms to suppress one side or the other. There are situations where we need one to get bigger and the other to get bigger. They have this ability to decide to take all of our attention and hand it off. And so this is what we need to be able to restore, and that ability to be able to do all of them and dance between it and know when and what would be an unstuck attention system. And that's what we would be wanting to restore is the coordination, not just switching from one to the other. So if we want to go further into kind of the felt sense of what is this Western world that we're dealing with, and we're talking about things that are broken into parts that have lost their context. That basically, the way we end up with a closed system by definition is we lose context. We say there's outside the system, nothing else matters. So every time we create a closed system or we lose context, we are setting the conditions of being vulnerable to having our attention trapped, which I'm going to go into in a minute. And so the signatures of what can do this are data, facts, platitudes, Newtonian formulations, where we describe everything as causal, the languaging around causality, and abstracted category structures that don't have natural kinds. I mean, they can't be brought in, recontextualized into the way the world actually works. They aren't emergent natural breaking points. They are made up breaking points or abstracted out breaking points that obfuscate or make it not possible to reground. Statistics in general do this, because if you go back to that original slide, in order to do statistics in general, you need something countable. You need to say this is like this other one, something normative. It needs to not change on you. And it needs to be non-dynamic. And so when we model in statistics, we end up equally stuck in systems where we can't reground them into reality. They can also end up with explanations of macro scale phenomena that cannot be grounded. People could argue economic models might also fall under this. Logical positivism is what's pointed at often as the academic making of this world, or part of the influence of this world, was that we came under a philosophy that said that what is real and can be observed is what matters. And so what can be predicted is what matters, and everything else that's imaginal is not helpful. And so we see this structure everywhere we look. And if you want lots of examples, I'd point at Ian McGilchrist's book on this, where he provides lots of examples. And when considering the problems with this, again, this whole talk, I'm not inventing anything. I'm trying to just curate arguments that people might be familiar with and point at things. That this closed system thinking, this idea of being able to name all parts into a framework or any kind of closed system, has been criticized for criticized on axiomatic grounds, on mathematical grounds. It shows up in incompleteness theorems, such as the Gödel incompleteness theorem or the halting problem. It shows up in the no free lunch theorem, which basically, let me back up. The incompleteness theorems say that you cannot ever have a logically consistent closed system. Halting problem says you could never have a perfect computer program if it's closed, that there's problems, and the world can't work like that. The no free lunch theorem is a way of saying that all scientific innovation and insight cannot come from inside a system, that it has to come from a subjective human mind, that a human mind must bring itself to bear on the problem, that you can't escape subjectivity, you can't escape the humanness of scientific insight. The problem of insight, inductive inference, as Judea Pearl elucidates that really nicely, that basically the problem with that you cannot come up with new ideas from closed systems. Again, you need abductive inference. For new interpretations of closed systems, you need to bring something in from outside the system. There are also paradoxes when you try to create closed systems, such as the liar's paradox, where we get into linguistic traps, or Simpson's paradox, where you have statistical information that can have nonsensical interpretations because that can only be resolved with context. So all of these problems basically are resolved by bringing in context, and they're all admissions to the limitation of closed system thinking in arriving at anything that's truthful, reliable, that is trustworthy, even, that we cannot trust these systems to reveal anything globally useful. They claim global utility because they are not grounded in a context. They're not grounded in a context, they're claiming global utility, and yet they do not have claims to global utility. So closed systems are problematic in this way. So a little pause. Any questions? Okay. And then, as Ian McGilchrist points out, that beyond it being problematic for our sense of what we can trust in the world, that we would come up with things that are not trustworthy or not truthful. When we expose ourselves to these kind of systems, we become untethered, ungrounded. When we are unable to ground a model, that is Ian McGilchrist's definition of, and others' definition of, the root of what we would call insanity. We also, whenever those loops are associated with any kind of emotional valence and a feedback, which I showed in the previous slide, it's possible to get caught into a situation where we have an explanation for something that leads to a loop in our thinking. And when that happens, the emotional valence of that loop will get amplified like a feedback resonator. And that is one working hypothesis for extreme psychological distress states, that they're a downstream effect of a trapped attention system left to ruminate and cycle through in this amplifying process. And this ability to fall victim to and be trapped into into these closed systems is what we're tagging as the root vulnerability that we have to address anything in our world. Just pointing out that if you get a sense for what these things feel like, you'll start to see that we're not only bombarded with them all the time, but we've internalized it as a way of thinking. We have become accustomed to that lowest rung way of thinking versus the highest rung, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So we often, this is our go-to way of problem solving, our go-to way of trying to make progress on any problem, is to try to, whether we like it or not, we've had it modeled so much, our first move is often to move to reductive, trying to come up with simplistic causal models and hope that that's kind of the single shot. It feels, it's seductively simple when we formulate them, but then as we see, as they gain this global, they're claiming this global context, they pile up. They pile up in that they cannot be contextualized, therefore they're all ever present. And in that way, they the candidates for parasitic processing. They cannot be compartmentalized if they are claiming global precedence. So here we're going to talk about how can we break up, how can we address a trapped attention system? And we're saying that there's one mechanism that we're aware of that makes logical sense, which is to restore context. What restores context? In order to get us out of a closed loop without context, we need to try to ground it in context. By attempting to ground it in context, we can either recognize it has no context, or we can understand the context where it's relevant, and then it becomes compartmentalized, and then it can be handled and recontextualized, as we'll talk about endlessly as we go through this, what that process is like. And we're saying it's a special form of inquiry that can do this. It's a kind of inquiry that needs to be in our imaginative workspace. So we generally want to do it in a solitary or in a, while we're doing the imagining, a sense of solitude. We can be alone together, but a sense of being able to use our entire imaginative workspace for applying inquiry. And it needs to be open-ended. So an open-ended question form where it takes the trapped content as the closed end of a question form. And then the open end has to ground into something that is not another part concept. If it attempts to ground in something that's another part concept, left hemisphere concept, you will just grow your model bigger. And you have not addressed the problem. It needs to ground in something that is below our conceptual framework into our direct experience. That may emerge as a conceptual, but it needs to be able to go into our direct experience and ground into our direct experience. So this is a diagram I kind of put together. We have this thing that's got our attention, and we're gonna, there'll be a form that the form, its job is to vibe. I'm just going to use that word because I'm trying to capture a lot of things right now, but sound music is a really good analogy. It's going to try to resonate into our deeper knowing part with everything that can vibe like that. So if you know about like resonance in music, there's harmonics. That's a good analogy that, you know, when you have two things that have similar frequencies, they'll resonate, they'll amplify. So you can think of it as like you're putting out a signal to start things resonating. And when they resonate, then you can get the associations out. You can start to access beyond the normal associations. So that's the basic form of an insight-based inquiry form, would be trying to look around and find the grounding and direct experience. And so the idea is that you could start with something that is some set of associations, and through the open form, go past the associative bias to find other forms. And there's other ways you can do this as well, but that's the open form, would be to trying to elicit and find resonant things beyond that form to attempt to open up and the closed form. There's a question.
Yeah, hi Jill.
Hi.
I'm wondering if you're saying that these connections are beyond the associative, is it just like beyond the associative with the models that you've already created and there's like some underlying association, or is the vibe, like, is there a potential for association there, but it's just something you haven't made?
Yeah, so I am gonna try to reveal that in gory detail in the next like 20 slides or so. But let me try a little precursor to that, because this is totally fundamental. As we're experiencing life, there's these hard associations that are the context that's given, my smells, my senses. Like I the grounding problem is I coordinate everything together into a sane interpretation of what's happening moment to moment, sane for me, like that I am interpreting the world in a stable way. And I am bringing in all kinds of associations to that. So I'm calling it the hard associations. Like, you guys are really in the meeting. That's a real association. Now, there can be counterfactual associations where I could imagine someone in the meeting who's not here. And in that way, I could say, well, who else could be in this meeting? And then I'll start to vibe with like, well, what kind of person would want to go to a STO meeting? And who's not here, has been here before? And I'm starting to come up with this envelope plausibility of pulling in a thought experiment, who else could be here? And now I've got this thing that is associated in a different way. It's not a hard given association. It's a kind of vibing association. And you can see as you do this kind of thought experiments, which we're going to go into more in depth later, I have already started a new concept creation process of like, what is the kind of person who would be at a STOA event? What is that kind of person? Now I've talked around this new thing I can imagine into. That thing can become reified as a concept I have and I use. And now I could like create a list and I can make that real. I could say, here are the people I want to invite to the next one. And now all of a sudden I've gone from something that was a light imaginal association into what could become in the future a concrete association. Is that a helpful example? I guess
Yes,
is there, cool, okay. Okay, and so when we do this open-ended question exercise on something that has our trapped attention, symbolized by these arrows going in a circle, it's a closed system. The idea is this is how we'd break out of these closed systems, is that we would start to bring in these different types of complex interactions we've been ignoring, that we've been in a quality of mind that's been trapped that only knows an analytic way of knowing. And now we're bringing in all these other ways of knowing, all these other dynamic, fluid, dyadic ways of interaction with the world, with the context, so that there still might be a causality, but it may not be a causality. It might be a false confabulation, or it may be there, but not everything going on. And so this is the idea of grounding, what the grounding process would be like. This would be the restoring of natural intelligence, and through this messy, restored knowingness of the context, we may see, if we think of each of these dots as being futures we could live into, or directions in our life, or possibilities, that we have revealed many more possibilities. And this is where the process, the insight process, is the way out of a lot of negative states, not just in perspective, but in actual material conditions and solution space, in both. It shows the way out when our attention is trapped, and this particularly when our attention is trapped in a painful way. And then coming back to the associative mind, as we make these associations, we also have this, what people might point out as a kind of development happening, where we are finding ways to connections beyond our normal life, the associations we normally adaptively made just to get through life. That we start to find ways that we look past the walls of the maze, and we may see new possibilities that we wouldn't have recognized in just in any part of our ordinary life. There's a two-way mutual enriching of restoring the context, new ways of navigating our lives beyond the normal associations that we didn't realize were serving as artificial hard constraints in our lives. And this is what a lot of people point out as kind of the insight process as being a liberation process, liberating process. So I'm almost done with the hour. That might be a good breaking point, because now I was actually going to talk about how it works, like get into the nitty gritty of all that. So that was just kind of an intro of that. Yeah, I think that maybe that would make sense, and we can pick it up next time, where I will go into very specific examples where we're going to do our own thought experiments, kind of like the one I did with the STOA audience. We're going to go into really concrete examples to get an idea, a felt sense, understanding of what's happening with conceptual blending, higher level cognition, restoring context, what the mind can do that these closed systems can't. And I'm going to start to go into what we need to know in order to navigate, like looking at the systems out there, what we would have to change in order to unlock this, these higher level cognition, higher rungs of causality, however you want to formulate it, these different ways of knowing and bringing this context in. So yeah, I think I'll pause there unless anyone wants me to. I guess maybe I'll leave it up to Peter. I think just to get a good breaking point.
Well, there's no questions in the chat yet. I just prompted if you have any questions for maybe the Q&A portion, put it in. I can warm you up with few questions, Jill, but if you want to continue, that might be cool too. Trust your discernment.
I guess if no one's worn out and everyone's expecting to be here for another 30 minutes, I could keep going, and maybe that'd be helpful.
What's the sense of people thumbs up? You want to keep going or want to keep? Okay, we got enough thumbs up, I think. Jill.
Okay. How this works? Okay, so sort of reverse pain. Like that was probably the most painful part of the 4 weeks, and now it should get easier and easier because now we're going to be grounding this into real examples, and you're going to start to see what I'm talking about with these abstractions. Looks like Danny has a question.
No, I don't. I was fiddling with the wrong icons, my dear. Please proceed.
No, okay, cool. Okay, so we're going to talk about now. Try to give you some ideas of kind of where that question was coming from. Of like, what are we talking about here with associations, and what's going on with the conceptual blends, and what's actually happening? What are we actually doing as part of our natural intelligence that we seem to be in a culture that's ignoring actively? In this world of counterfactual and higher level cognition, the slide I showed earlier. Let me actually, maybe I can, this slide. So the argument here is that we are in Judea Pearl's rungs of causality, we are stuck in many ways in this lowest rung. And as I was saying in this Conceptual Blends book, in terms of this counterfactual level, this is dealing with everything that happens in the counterfactual level as being the real heavy lifter of where our true power, cognitive power, comes from. And I do want to say that the Conceptual Blend book points at the fact that we are doing these things naturally, even if it's when our attention is not trapped, natural intelligence is doing this. Culturally, in the Western world, we are not recognizing it. So there's other books that point about this too, like A History of Science, that we are not acknowledging these layers. We're not acknowledging them as being valid, mainly because they, by necessity, are counterfactual. They include the imaginal. They're the world of metaphor, analogy, story, everything else, that they are not concrete. So we aren't acknowledging them as being the engine behind innovation and everything else. And I'll come back to that. So, okay, so how this works, the conceptual blend process. So in our life, we are given a set of patterns, and this can be associations of, a scenario in our world with people and things and dynamics and beliefs and behaviors and all these kind of things. There's all these things that go into something that we bring to mind. When we bring something to mind, all the associations that come to mind. Conceptual blend process says that we can bring a variety of these to mind, and something happens as they occupy our head space together, is we find ways without even trying that we find patterns. And so this is like one example I'm showing where if I were to rotate these various ways, I could see they're the same shape. And that's a pattern I found. So there's this pattern finding thing that can happen. You can also have very different things that feel very, very different and still find patterns across differences. And see and bring them together in our mind, very different things that maybe have similar shapes enough that they vibe together and they come to mind in some way, which we're going to talk about later, so that they can hang out together in a cognitive workspace. And now here's where the magic happens. This is what makes us human, and this is what makes us not machines. When we do that, somehow we know we can create a new animal that is reliable. This is that is reflective of something. We create a new animal, a new concept that is a blend of some array of other things in a counterfactual process that isn't just an average, isn't just a combining, it's a compression. We know somehow what to leave out and what to include, how to do it and how to modify it. That is the magic of natural intelligence that we don't know how to represent in machines, and is not represented in algorithms, but it's what we know our minds do. And as we do this, we find these things naturally through what we consider part of memory reconsolidation. There's this data compression. Our world becomes simpler. We have a new way of understanding things in a way that explains, we don't lose information. We don't lose what we know it deeper. We know it, we know it where it came from. We don't lose the grounding. We don't lose the source, but we can come up with a new concept, a new way of knowing it that simplifies our thinking. And this is what humans do. And this is the natural insight process of conceptual blending. And I'll give you a couple examples from the book to ground this in what this is like, to give you hopefully a felt sense of doing this and how it is not, how it compares to factual knowing. So this is the classic example. You can see this in the book and even on the wiki page on the conceptual blend material. And I'll just read this for everybody in case people have low res here. A Buddhist monk begins at dawn one day, walking up a mountain. He reaches the top at sunset. He meditates at the top for several days until one dawn when he begins to walk back to the foot of the mountain, which he reaches at sunset. Making no assumptions about his starting or stopping or about his pace during the trips, prove that there is a place on the path which he occupies at the same hour of the day on the two separate journeys. And so I'll give everyone 1 minute just to consider this, and then I'll walk through the solution. So I don't know if everyone had this experience, but I'll describe an experience of approaching this problem. So if you were to play it out linearly and imagine the sequence of the monk walking up the mountain, and then you imagine later monk coming down the mountain, it can almost seem like I'm not sure if it's possible that he occupied the same place at the same time. Linear thinking, it doesn't seem to work. I can't determine the time which that's possible. I can't think through when that happened. But if I were to do a counterfactual experiment where one version has the monk driving down in the car on the same day. So the counterfactual is that the day he walks up is the same as the day he drives down. And now the monk drives down in the car the same day he's walking up in my counterfactual thought experiment. And I say, is there a time when he passes himself in the car? Is there a place where he passes himself in the car? If there's a place where he passes himself in the car, which he must pass himself, will it be the same time for both those monks when he passes? It will be the same time for both monks as he passes himself. So this was, you don't know when it is, but you've bounded using impossibilities, an envelope of plausibility, and you've persuaded yourself that this has to be true. So this is an idea of where you can use counterfactual reasoning to come up with something that's true without being able to say exactly when. If we were to take logical positivism and say, well, let's measure it. If you can't measure it, it didn't happen, then you would never be able to prove it. So this is a very different way of coming at how to know something. Before I move on to the next one, is there any questions about this one? Okay. This next one is one that I'm referencing Judea Pearl for using this example, a version of it, but I actually also used this example when I was studying earth science, climate science, as a way to try to explain what we should do, that we know enough to know what we need to do for climate change, and using a thought experiment versus data. And so the idea here, similar to the monk, is that if in the situation we're in right now, if we take a logical positivist view of what we should do and how we should act based on data, by the time we get the data, it'll be too late. It's 200 years to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So we can't wait for the data. Can we do better? And in a logical positivist world, the way we've been trying to do better is by creating models and then predicting and then gambling on what predictively would be true in a model logical positivist world. And the argument here is using our higher level cognition, we actually can prove climate change without any data. And we're going to do it through impossibilities. So the idea here is to do a thought experiment again. And this time we're going to have, like the two monks, we're going to have two earths. On one earth, it's called the earth on the left, I'm going to add way more CO2 to the earth on the right. And now I can say what changes. And so I will run through this pretty quickly. If there's people that have a physics background, they can just verify. If there's people that don't, they can take my word for it that through impossibilities, this is what physicists know. So we can say right now that the Earth with more CO2, the one on the left, we know CO2 absorbs radiation in an overlapping spectrum with water vapor. So at the poles, the delta in the absorption of the CO2, this is just based on atomic spectra data, not the Earth, atomic spectra data, atoms, what we know about how atoms work, and molecules work. And so we know that where there's less water vapor, there'll be more warming from CO2. So that means there's going to be a disproportionate amount of warming at the poles in the Earth that has more CO2. If there's a differential warming, that means the temperature gradient between the poles and the equator is going to be less in the left Earth than the right Earth. We know that temperature gradient is the raw energy source of mid-latitude storm systems, and that if you change the energy source, you're going to change the nature of the storm track. And you're going to also change the height of the clouds. And you're going to change the frequency of the storm track. And if you change the storm track, you're going to change where the water falls and how much and where on the planet it falls. You're also going to obviously melt the ice caps. So all these are changes we know happen just by virtue of knowing the nature of how thermodynamic systems work, heat engines applied to the Earth atmosphere, and atomic spectra data. That's all we know, all we need to know. And then all we have to add to it to say, are we changing the climate, is to look at the carbon dating of the carbon in the atmosphere, because carbon that was taken out through fossil fuels underground will have a different signature than the carbon that's been cycling through the plant matter on the planet. And then we can say, okay, we know this is the amount that came out of our tailpipes, and now we could do the accounting on that. We can say this CO2 is from us, and we are changing the climate. And then we can say, what do we rely on for our human life support system? We rely on stable rainfall for our infrastructure, for our crops, for everything else, for our sea level. And so the climate change argument has been, the science has been in on climate change since the 1960s, when we first did the Keeling curve and understood that we were the ones dumping all the CO2 into the atmosphere. Once we knew that, we had enough science to know that we were playing games with a system we couldn't predict, and we wouldn't be able to predict, and we wouldn't be able to model. That's a nonlinear system that could get us in all kinds of ways. And so the entire climate debate is an example of our attention being captured in lower level cognitive systems, logical positivism, and an inability to entertain this other ways of reasoning, this thought experiment way of reasoning. Demonstrated through the conceptual blends. Is there any questions about that example? Okay. So back to our insight-based inquiry forms, we're saying that these insight-based inquiry forms are activating the raw material for the conceptual blends, because they are helping us bring to mind and bring things into our cognitive workspace so that we can start to reveal these things for ourselves, either in a counterfactual, it can be counterfactual way, or even a factual way, you know, or I should say, well, it's all counterfactual, but it might be highly implausible, or even plausible might be equally valid in showing us something about how our world works. So trustworthy insights that are not, even though they're using the they're productive imaginings, they're using imaginal capacity, can lead to truthful, trustworthy knowings. And that is Judea Pearl's argument, and that is the argument behind how the scientific process works and insight process works. So the idea, this idea that we're bounded by impossibilities, if you'll want to read more about, well, let me say a little bit more about that. When I'm talking about what we just did with the Earth experiment, if I were to break down how we were able to walk through that blow by blow, we would see that there's all kinds of things we didn't realize that we know in order for you to follow along with my logic. Beyond the basic physics, we know things like the CO2 doesn't magically disappear. It doesn't turn into a different element. The atmosphere is going to stick on the Earth. There's going to be a net amount of heat coming in from the sun. The amount of radiation from the sun's not going to change. These are things that we know we don't know, that we're, without even realizing it, bringing in as impossibilities. It's impossible for the sun's radiation to all of a sudden change in a way that's meaningful for this thought experiment. It's unreasonable to expect CO2 to turn into nitrogen in this thought experiment. It doesn't do that. It's not reasonable to expect things are just going to suddenly disappear or transport themselves in space. But that may seem trivial, but this is exactly what we're leveraging in very powerful ways that we have as our basic natural intelligence system, the fundamental foundation of our ability to reason. And it is what it is what scientists leverage. And there's actually an interesting movement, which I thought I had this slide. I don't think I'll have it later, but constructor theory, which I can link to later, where it's a reformulation of the basic physics laws into impossibilities. They're already kind of formulated as impossibilities. It's just making that explicit, that people are reasoning through impossibilities. So basically, Natural intelligence works through carving out envelopes of plausibility, not truth, plausible. And within that, lots of things can be plausible, and plausible is good enough. And in this way, our own reasoning process makes us natural born scientists. There's nothing new scientists are bringing. The Einsteins of the world, the Teslas are not bringing something new. This is what we are already doing without realizing it. We already come baked in with these capacities that are incredibly powerful, that allow us to know, reveal what's plausible, and find our way forward in our life all the time, imagine reliably into life. And so now I guess I can, let's see, I think I can go through these last few slides actually pretty quick. So maybe I'll try to do that. Because now I'm just gonna be applying this a little bit. Now, if we look at, again, our closed system, but in a world without context, if we bring our open-ended question forms, our inquiry, to a system that has no context, we're blank. If it can't be grounded and it doesn't resonate or vibe with anything, if it's purely abstract, if it's a purely abstract categorization that isn't alive in us in any way, that we can't have a felt sense into or sensing into, we're blank. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't lead to that process is thwarted. And so it only, and saying also that means it's also blank if the thing consuming that information doesn't work like a human mind does. So if we're dealing with the world of data-based processes, when they attempt to take complex data from across domains and blend it the way we're doing and bring them together, the best it can do is average. It has no context to be able to do this selection. It can't understand what's plausible and what's not. It comes up with a blended nonsense. The only way this becomes trustworthy is if the statistics are so oversampled and so good that you happen upon the exact scenario and context you were asking about. And this is all AI right now. This is all, AI does not know how to build a system that does the conceptual blending we do. There's no proposals on the table. There's nothing it knows how to work with the impossible, knows how we bring that context in to reveal what's plausible. That is not how these systems work. So they fundamentally come up with a combined form that is statistical, but equally not groundable. And in some ways, if we think about, this is, I guess I'll just say it as a soundbite right now, I'm not going to go into it, but what is data? Data is the status, it's a snapshot, it's a passing time, it's a removal from context. In many ways, when we articulate things, when we are actively doing the focusing move, the modeling move, engaging our left hemisphere into the model building move, we're designed to do that when things are salient, immediate, instant, when it's life or death, when it's causal. And when we're done with it, that's a waste product. That is not reality. That is a contraction. Now some things, not everything, some things can be reduced down, like the impossible, right? So things that are reductive and not waste products are things that define what's impossible, like saying that things can't be two places at once, or saying that things are conserved, that kind of thing, or saying that things move forward in time, in a continuum. These kind of things are not of the same quality, but we aren't making those distinctions. So we come up with a simplified model that sounds as simple as that, but it's different because it's trying to say what's true. It's not revealing what's impossible. It's not a constraint model. It's a container part model. And the illusion, and this is what Ian McGilchrist also points out, when we are in the trapped hemisphere mode, which he points out we are spending a predominant amount of our time in, the illusion is that if we put enough of these things together, it'll start to look like a living thing. It's the Frankenstein concept, that we can't tell the difference between layers and layers and layers of global systems and that kind of complexity, the difference between that and a natural version. And as part of this is my dramatic interpretation. We also may be so distracted with the overwhelm and the capture that we don't even notice what's happening behind the scenes, which is our systems that are generating all this are not maintainable. These are a lot of closed systems to maintain. Closed systems are maintained by living systems. Every closed system, every machine, everything has to be tended to by energy from living systems. And as we accumulate, we're running out of energy to maintain them and they're crumbling. And we may not even notice if our attention is trapped because we're not grounding them into that reality. And we may confuse it with what we may sense as equally complex or dynamic or involved and nuanced, can have just as many moving parts of a naturally intelligent system. And the difference between these two, this and this, which I'm going to argue more later, is that this has a shot. This complexity is groundable, and because it's groundable, it doesn't explode in complexity. It solves the problems of the big data crunch we're in and everything else. And I will, one more slide, and then I will be switching to talk about more specifically about insight-based inquiry forms. So this will be, I think, the place we should stop now. So just kind of stepping back on this, what would this look like? I just want to speak to the felt sense of interacting with these two ways of knowing. When we're interacting with closed systems, we learn by mimicry. We are introduced through procedures. Things are articulatable. We may be able to assign things as stages, hierarchies. They can be constructed. Things can be constructed out of other things. We can move through memorization. There's a correct solution. It's a closed system interface. It's very useful when we're working with technologies. It's sources for successful society interface. Basically, our current society runs off rules and closed systems. So we have to successfully integrate with that right now for our survival. And gatekeepers to this conceptual knowledge are teachers. If we move to now the complete opposite of the world, we're all fluid, all this last slide, no closed systems, all open systems, all fluid dynamic systems. We would have to learn through intervention, that stage 2 rung of playing, poking, perturbing, and interacting, to learn through interaction. We'd have to engage our constructive imagination, thought experiments, or rehearsal imaginings. We have to imagine into things. Things are unfolding faster than they aren't causal. So we have to use our intuition and imagine into outcomes. We have to learn the space of feasible solutions by doing. That's again, back to intervention. We're going to be learning by doing. We would be learning how to learn in those environments. And we would be situating another person to us isn't a teacher. They are a situated first-person tacit knowledge holder, an expert by experience that serve as a source of future thinking, agency, and hope for us to move through this environment, which I'm going to come back to. Ultimately, life has to become our teacher. So instead of people as teacher, life itself becomes our teacher, as it was when we were infants, learning how to operate our body, learning how to make sense of sounds, language, sight, environment. We had to interact with life as our teacher. We were returning to that way of knowing and learning. Okay, so I'm going to stop here and then we can pick it up next time, talking specifically about the insight-based inquiry forms and language and what a solution looks like. And then, or I might leapfrog that. In any event, the handoff next time when we move past the conceptual material will be to take all of this imaginings of what the difference is between a naturally intelligent fluid system, the parts we've been leaving out, the part that's been anemic, and look at a lab where people have been steeped in the Western mind, as described by Ian McGilchrist, and are forced to restore the parts that are missing. And then look at what that restoration looks like, what we could expect to emerge, where does it emerge from, what comes back, the pathway, how it comes back. And as part of that same set of thought experiments and examples, we're going to be looking specifically at a environment where a mind steeped in that way of thinking is forced to deal with surviving a hostile fluid environment in a very short amount of time to start to test the clock cycles and start to show what it looks like based on the framework I'm going to show you here in a bit, to be able to map out what is a naturally intelligent system doing to save itself through the examples of air sports where there's on the order of seconds to come up with solutions to save your life. And look at what does a naturally intelligent system have to do to pull that off, and to bring an intuitive base to what we're moving into, and what we can imagine the restoration might look like, and hopefully as a way of inspiration and hope to see that how quickly it comes back and how powerful it is, and the ways it comes back and what people do collectively and individually on that pathway that we can learn from. So that's where I plan to go next. So I'll stop here and see if there's any questions on that last bit.
Awesome. I'm going to stop the screen share.
Okay.
We have a couple of questions in the chat, but Danny, you had your hand up.
Yes, but Peter, don't you have a question to feed into the space?
I have a question, but I'll save mine for the end.
Okay. So this one particular point, my whole system kept getting hooked on your use of impossibilities. And it became clear to me that it seems like this might be an AI term, it might be a physics term that you're very used to using. But what was happening in me is that I kept saying, why aren't we navigating for the possibilities? Because that's what the imaginal is. So that use of the word impossibilities is really it's not working for me. Okay. Right? You know, so, and I think because I don't have those two backgrounds, and I know you're not just addressing just
yeah, let me try to unpack that a little bit. So let me try to ground that concept for everybody. It's quite groundable. It's as simple as things like I started to point at, believe it or not, that we know we're unique. There's one of me and one of you. We know one moment follows from the next. Like, it's impossible for there to be two of me. It's impossible for me to be two places at once. It's impossible for the next moment to not follow from the previous moment. So you see how I reframe those same ideas. Like peekaboo, you know, things disappear and come back, and the child realizes that things don't just appear from nowhere. It's impossible for things to just appear from nowhere. So the reason to try to hang with this formulation of what's impossible is that, as we'll see in real-time life, what we want to do is simplify our thinking processes, and by focusing on the impossible, we start to carve out and remove possibilities that only leave what's plausible. And when we're trying to move in through life, it's usually overwhelm, a fatigue. Like, it could be everything. Everything feels possible. And when everything feels possible, we're frozen. So the impossibility starts to show us the way forward. It carves out what we can imagine into. And it's a little counterintuitive, but that is why clarity feels like a simplification. Like how relieving it is when it's like, okay, I now know what I need to do. I'm not sitting here with like 5 different ways this could unfold. I don't know if I have cancer, I don't have cancer. At least I know. I know what's impossible. I know it's possible. There's a relief as we bring in these constraints, our thinking simplifies and the way forward emerges. And so in this way, this natural intelligence way of deciding into a natural system is not this binary, what are my possibilities and which one do I like the best? It's much more like, what I don't know yet. If there's 3 possibilities, I probably need to look in a different direction to think about that, oh, this isn't actually a possibility for me, because if I do this, I'm gonna be really unhappy, or this person's not gonna like it, or, you know, I don't have the money for that, or, you know, like, while it feels like everything's possible, you keep looking, and then pretty soon you come to terms with what is your envelope of plausibility. And if you miss one of them, then the outcome can be detrimental. And that's you know, why it's worthwhile for us to do these imagining these exercises up front to future think, to try to find ways forward.
Yes, I like the use of the word of the envelope of possibilities.
Yeah, plausibility.
I grounded in there. Okay,
Yeah.
I grounded in two ways. One, I went, oh, I'm going to test all the possibilities, the infinite potential against the impossibilities that I can also be aware of now. I can
Yeah,
test.
but you don't have to have the possibilities. You can just start with the impossibilities. That's the nice part.
So you're saying.
So let's take that Earth example, right? If we wanted to say, what are all the possible Earth outcomes? We don't know what those are because we can't predict the Earth system good enough to know what everything is that's possible. If you talk to a climate scientist, like what is actually possible, they would tell you there's all kinds of things possible most people haven't heard of because they don't publish papers on it, but there's lots of things that are possible. Monsoons can turn off. We've seen that in history. You know, you can have the whole ITCZ could shut down. We don't have water welling up anymore, and we have no more oxygen production. We could kill off everything with plastic and shut off oxygen that way too. There's all kinds of things are possible. This isn't a way forward necessarily for us to find what we should actually do. So if we look at now this deconstruction of like, what are all the things we can do? Well, the impossible. It's impossible for us to have a stable climate and increase one of the dependent variables radically like we've done. We will not have a stable climate. That's impossible. That's all we need to know, if that makes sense. So there's some simplifying moves with the thought experiments that reveal that our only envelope plausibility is to try to perturb the Earth system as slowly as possible so we have time to adapt. That'd be the only sane direction to try to make that choice. We lost, okay. And then can we predict beyond that? No, it's impossible because we don't know the system well enough and it's nonlinear. Okay, in the face of that impossibility, what should we do?
Oh, that's another way you're saying it. Okay, so
yeah,
noticing the impossibilities that I do know, that I meet up with.
Yeah. So doing the thought experiments, when we're doing thought experiments, we don't realize that that's what we're doing. Things are being revealed to us because we are bringing all this knowledge of what's impossible that we don't even know we know. The way we construct our reality is bringing all these things forth that we rule out and using our imagination productively is the way we ignite this higher level cognition and can move forward in lots of ways we've been stuck, as well as not being victim to all the trapped attention formulations.
So let's sneak in maybe one or two more questions and we'll close off for today. Lisa, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. I wanted to ask about in postmodernity, if we think about the tendency of the postmodern structure of feeling as wanting to recontextualize or having that impulse to, I'm thinking of Nora Bateson's work, for example.
Yeah.
Would you say that that's a nascent form of natural intelligence when we see that kind of a turn in the way we do science, like post-normal science or postmodern influences on science?
I think that what it comes down to, a successful postmodern versus unsuccessful postmodern, an unsuccessful postmodern would be to keep that same habit of mind I was speaking to of building reductive models into your context. So you overgeneralize your context because you haven't done the integrative work. And we're going to talk a lot about what that looks like in the next parts of what is that integrative work going to look like, right? Without it, then you just have basically more of a reductive mode, but through your first person perspective, which is correct. The first move is correct to start with first person. We can talk about that, but that has to be contextualized in such a way that you find the boundaries that you don't overgeneralize. And if we're in a habit of mind of constructing these overgeneralized closed system thinking, it's the habit of mind we're in. So that's what I see often is that when that happens, all you've done is add to complexity, and then you're increasing the burden of overwhelm. Everybody's claiming global, for instance, like this was an argument against the pronoun business that I think was misunderstood, which is that it's a lot of cognitive work to say globally I have to monitor what had been an automatic languaging of pronouns and now add in, we speak in pronouns so often, I need to have this global cognitive work to monitor and change this really deep habit. And so there's some justice to that. And then there's also like layers of burden. We feel each person saying, I want to be considered in all moments in this way, and this way, and this, and this way, and start stacking up. So another way of doing that would be, to, if you really had the opportunity to sit down with whoever it is that's important that you're in relation to and really get their world, you would quite naturally speak to them the way they'd want to be addressed. You'd understand the meaningfulness in their direct experience. And then also there'd be an understanding people don't know you that way, just wouldn't have the context to understand that you don't like that you would not, but it wouldn't be a claim that it should be a global change necessarily. Now, and that's not to say we shouldn't be making, global changes. I'm just using that as like an example of where it's created a lot of tension and frustration because of the cognitive load, I think, that people are feeling with how you're trying to accommodate everybody.
So, any follow-up, Lisa? No? Okay, cool. Journey, you had a question.
Hey, I really enjoyed this chat. Really useful. From one of the previous workshops you ran, you and McLean spoke about different patterns of application for the inquiry process. And I thought the emphasis on conceptual blending today was, I'm not sure how it plugs in my mind yet, but I was just wondering if you could speak to how different patterns themselves could somehow blend into one another. I mentioned in the example last time. Oh, go ahead. We'll go from there.
Did you have an example you remember from last time that we talked about? You're saying?
I think you had us run through a fictional character, but it ended up being.
The Cinderella example, that one?
Yeah.
About? Right. Yeah. So let me see if I have your question right. You're curious about, it sounds like you want more grounded examples of what conceptual blending is like so that you can get a feel for it. Is that accurate?
It was more so that the different ways that conceptual blending can be applied end up being applied in ways that we didn't actually intend them to. For example, the fictional character ends up becoming really a way of patterning our
right.
past life or future life configurations.
Right. Okay, so I think what you're asking is like, maybe using that as an example when I talk about scientific insight, where Einstein all of a sudden thought, well, what if time is, relative? Whoa, and then there's something there like, wow, that's like a familiar scientific insight we know about. And then I had shared in a previous workshop that Journey is part of, this example of a thought experiment of being Cinderella at middle age that I did using, which we're going to get into, the insight-based inquiry forms to look around as that person myself. I did that exercise. And I was surprised at the insights I was having because I was raised with a Cinderella story, having this kind of happily ever after. And when I did the exercise of what it'd be like to be 40 as Cinderella, I started to realize there's all kinds of problems with class and that she was like, her looks are failing and the prince is actually a player. And, there's all these problems with the townspeople, and she couldn't relate to her own daughter. It wasn't the way she was raised. And she really felt insecure and like imposter syndrome and how difficult it was for her to step up and be this role model and all her past trauma and how part of her just wanted to retreat and not have anything to do with the whole business. And I thought that was really interesting. It just never occurred to me until I did that thought experiment. And what was interesting because a validation is I started looking up alternate tellings of the Cinderella story, and that one's very aligned with the gypsy telling, which is a cautionary tale to never go off with a prince because it'll just be a nightmare. You should be perfectly happy living this way. So I thought that was an example of an unexamined narrative that I could just go along with the Disney version through repetition and say like, gosh, who doesn't want to be a princess and be swept away and showered and beautiful? And And it's like, well, let's think about it for a minute, and feeling like that was a culturally trustworthy. Other people kind of recognize the problems there that just never occurred to me. And through doing that experiment, yeah, I think doing those thought experiments, we are enriched. And so we do really reveal, like, of course it'd be impossible for of course it'd be impossible for her to perfectly relate to her daughter, a princess experience of growing up in a palace versus the way she grew up. Of course that would be impossible for her to feel like she could perfectly relate. So these are really common sense things I could bring to bear on it. Of course, she would feel inadequate given, to represent royalty when she hasn't really grew up knowing how to behave in those ways, but in those echelons.
All right. Thanks, Jenny. And I'm tempted to ask this question, but maybe I'll just presence it, and then you can think about it for next week, Jill. And yeah, maybe you can find where it's appropriate to respond to what session. But I was thinking about the liminal web, or what's now people are calling the wisdom web, like, John Vervaeke, Louis Dewar, Lynn Pascal. Like, what do they get wrong? What do they get right from your perspective? And maybe that could be like something you respond to in the next session, unless you want to take a stab at it now.
Let me see if anything comes up immediately. I think that a lot of, let's see. Well, I think that the short answer is that anybody who's interested in that, they watch the whole series, I think it'll become apparent how I'm coming at things differently, what the delta is. And if I had to point out what that is, I think in general, the entire liminal web and everybody probably listening to this, they're not sure what the doing is with emergence, and that there feels like there's more doing that needs to be done. Like the doer is almost always the trapped attention. And so, but then you think, well, then what am I doing? What do I do? And so that's what I'm pointing out, this is a necessary move to hand over life as the teacher to find out what the doing is. Like, the doing has to be revealed through emergence. And as it gets revealed, as we're talking about, as the only envelope of plausibility for your life, you don't even have to worry about it. It's what you're going to do. So like, you don't even have to think about it. Like, thinking about it's probably like the thing you don't have to do. You don't have to plan it or train for it or try to better yourself for it. You will, if you really can do this inquiry process into really investigating what is the only plausible way forward right now with how crazy the world is. And if you can find a plausible way forward, because there's so few, that's the one you'll take, So it's kind of not acknowledging how that hunt for what's plausible will reveal. And then the time you're thinking or planning, I've been watching this show Alone, which is where they drop people off in nature and try to survive. And one of the words of wisdom for future alone competitors, just don't even plan, don't even think about it. Because it's not going to be what you think. Once you're out there, just trying to stay alive is you just don't want any ideas. It's just going to come at you. And I feel like that's some of what I hope people could get a sense of that, that's waiting for people, that way of engaging through inquiry to question everything, this, and to trust your natural intelligence to be working with things with each other that will literally emerge, that's where it'll come from. And so the planning and the thinking about what should emerge is understandably the only obvious move to make, and has been the only obvious move other than inquiry. So that's kind of other than some sort of way to more actively engage inquiry. So it's maybe the biggest lens I can come at. And quite specifically, trusting AI, which we're going to go into in depth later, would be my big concern. That I don't think AI risk is correctly being articulated, and it's and we can, because I kind of already said it, because the nature of the trapped attention, AI is just creating a system you cannot, your natural intelligence system cannot interface with, because it cannot ground the output of an AI system, current AI. So it's not trustworthy in any way. It should not be a decision support tool. It's not necessary. The answer to the overwhelming complexity is restoring context. That can be done through inquiry, which we're going to see in the next series. That's the solution to the relevance realization. That is context. And then within context, this can handle it. It doesn't get overwhelmed. It only gets overwhelmed with everything's claiming global. And everything claiming global on top of everything claiming global is the AIs we're interfacing with, which is just nonsense. So that all needs to be thrown out. And I'd say in their place, if you want to look at a prime example of how this is beautifully done, this is GIS, a global information system. Like what we do for the weather forecast, what we do for any kind of prediction, what we do with maps. Like we are grounding things into reality, and it's very, very useful. We're situating data and we're able to look it up within context, extremely useful. We all use the weather forecast, endlessly. That's like such a success of the correct interface of natural intelligence with technology. So there should be a huge, take those trillions of dollars for AI, put it completely into situated cognition, that we can, real tools, so we can really understand how to find the people we need. What are they up to? What are they about? What's going on? What's going, where are the resources? That's what we really need. Not decision support through nonsensical giant artificial brains. Mm-hmm. And I used to build those. So, I'm coming as a builder. I spent 4 years building giant AI brains in the optimization algorithm company. And so I can talk about that too. So I'm not a punter, I'm not a commentator. I am now, but back then I was a complete participant in that world. And so it's definite shortcomings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a cool answer. I imagine we'll have a bunch of other questions for you next week, Jill. So any parting thoughts you'd like to leave with us today?
Well, I hope you all appreciate it. I know it's super abstract, and I'm hoping it's going to get a lot more. It's going to be storytelling and fun and participation and imagining. Like that was the hard part. We really did the hard part of trying to have these abstractions that we can keep referring back to, that will fill them in, that they'll get more and more intuitive, so we can move through these things and start to map them out and start to really see in our mind's eye the way forward. That's my vision for this series, I hope. So I thank everybody for hanging in there.
Yeah,
this is like really abstract.
That was awesome. Let's give Jill a round of applause. That was
thanks.
And my mind is properly blown today. I had way in the morning, and then Jill, and we're going to take a nice have a drink and go to bed. So yeah, look forward to seeing you next week, everyone. And Jill, thanks so much again for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody.